The champagne flute felt cold, a slender icicle against Elizabeth's age-spotted hand. From across the sprawling living room, a sea of faces, friends and neighbours from Willow Creek, all turned toward her husband. Richard stood bathed in the warm, golden light of the chandelier, a 78-year-old man, carved from success and self-satisfaction. He raised his own glass, the crystal catching the light like a trapped star. 50 years. Richard began his voice a rich, practiced baritone that had charmed bank presidents and city council members alike. 50 years with this incredible woman. He smiled, a perfect, brilliant white gesture aimed directly at her. Elizabeth felt the smile land on her like a spotlight, and she produced the one she'd been practicing for half a century. It was placid, supportive, the smile of a contented matriarch. They say behind every great man is a great woman. He continued, a low chuckle rippling through the assembled guests. But Elizabeth was never behind me. She was the foundation beneath my feet, the quiet wisdom in a chaotic world. While I was out there fighting the dragons of the business world, she was here creating a sanctuary, a home. He paused, letting the sentiment hang in the air, thick as the scent of the white roses spilling from dozens of vases. Elizabeth watched him, her gaze unwavering. She saw the man, but she also saw the architecture of the performance, the slight tilt of the head for humility, the hand placed over the heart for sincerity. Every move was as polished as the silverware on the tables. She gave me a son, our David Richard said, nodding towards their son, who stood beside his wife, Sarah. David offered a tight filial smile. Sarah's was wider, more dazzling. Her eyes flicking around the room, assessing the value of the paintings, the weight of the drapery. And through them, she helped build a legacy, not just of business, but of family, of tradition. So I ask you all to raise your glasses, not to me, not to 50 years of marriage, but to the architect of it all, to my Elizabeth. The room erupted in applause, and the chorus of "To Elizabeth." The sound washed over her. She took a small, neat sip of her champagne. It tasted like ashes and sugar. Richard made his way through the crowd, accepting backpats and handshakes, a king in his court. When he finally reached her, he leaned in and kissed her cheek. His lips were dry. "Well done, my dear," he whispered, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. Perfect evening. It was not a compliment on their shared life. It was a director praising his lead actress for hitting her marks. Hours later, the last car had pulled away its taillights, shrinking into the Oregon darkness. The silence that descended upon the house was immense, a vacuum where the noise and laughter had been. The caterers had cleared most of the debris, but the ghost of the party remained a single abandoned napkin, the lingering smell of perfume and wilted flowers. Elizabeth was in the kitchen, carefully rinsing the 2 champagne flutes they had used for the toast. Richard's and hers. It was a ritual. After every major event, she washed the special glasses by hand. She heard his footsteps on the polished oak of the hallway. They were firm, decisive, not the tired end of a long night shuffle she expected. He appeared in the doorway, not in his tuxedo anymore, but in a crisp travel polo shirt and slacks. A leather weekender bag was on the floor beside him. It was new. She had never seen it before. She placed a flute carefully in the drying rack. "Are you going somewhere?" she asked, her voice perfectly even. The quiet in the room was so profound she could hear the hum of the sub-zero refrigerator. "I am," he said. He didn't move from the doorway. He leaned against the frame, casual as if discussing the weather. "I won't be coming back." The second champagne flute slipped from her soapy fingers. It didn't shatter. The thick, expensive crystal hit the rubber mat at the bottom of the sink with a dull, sickening thud. Elizabeth stared at it, the water from the tap running over its elegant stem. "I see," she said, her voice a stranger's. She turned off the water. Richard seemed almost disappointed by her lack of hysterics. He pushed himself off the doorframe and took a few steps into the kitchen, his posture radiating a kind of weary patience, as if dealing with a difficult but necessary bit of paperwork. Liz, we've had a good run. A great run, even. 50 years. That's more than most people get. We built something remarkable. He gestured vaguely at the house, the life around them. But it's over. I'm tired of this. This, she repeated the word, a small hollow sound. This quiet. This predictability. I need vibrancy, Elizabeth. I need life. I have another chapter to live, and I can't live it here. She finally looked up from the sink and met his eyes. There was no conflict in them, no pain, only a chilling, placid certainty. Her name is Chloe, she stated. It wasn't a question. She had seen the unusually detailed credit card statements, the late-night texts he thought he'd hidden. She had assumed it was a sordid, temporary foolishness, an old man's pathetic cliché. He almost looked impressed. Yes, her name is Chloe. He said it with a certain pride. She's full of energy. She has a real spark. She's 26, Elizabeth said, the number falling into the sterile silence of the kitchen. I saw her picture. She makes videos of herself dancing on the internet for strangers. Richard's face tightened. She's a content creator, a digital influencer. It's a significant business, you'd be surprised. She has over 2 million followers on TikTok. He said it as if announcing a Nobel Prize. She makes me feel young, Liz. She makes me feel seen. And I make you feel old, Elizabeth finished for him. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were floating above the scene, watching two actors in a terribly written play. This isn't about you, not really, he said, the condescension in his voice as sharp as a shard of glass. It's about me. It's about my life. What's left of it. I'm not going to spend my last years in a museum. He picked up his bag, the leather creaking with newness. Now I've already spoken to my lawyer. We'll be fair. Generous, even. The fortune. I built it, with my own 2 hands, but I'll see to it that you're comfortable. You'll want for nothing. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. The fortune. He built it. She thought of the inheritance from her father, the seed money that had funded his very first risky venture, the money that had saved him from bankruptcy twice in the early 80s. Her money. Her family's legacy, which he had masterfully rebranded as his own singular achievement over 5 decades. He saw her silence as acquiescence, as weakness. He gave her a final, pitying look. Try not to be bitter, Elizabeth. It's unbecoming. Think of it as a corporate restructuring, a necessary one for future growth. He turned and walked away. She didn't follow. She stood perfectly still, listening to the sounds. The sound of his footsteps receding down the hall, the heavy sound of the front door opening, and the final, clean, quiet click of the latch closing, severing 50 years as neatly as a pair of scissors cutting a thread. She was alone. The only sound left was the slow, steady drip of water from the tap onto the upturned, unbroken champagne flute in the sink. The silence of the house in the days that followed was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer peaceful. It was a presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket of absence. The scent of roses faded, replaced by the stale, dusty smell of a place holding its breath. Elizabeth moved through the rooms like a ghost, her footsteps swallowed by the thick carpets. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a life that had been a lie. Then the vultures arrived. The doorbell chimed a bright, jarring sound that made Elizabeth flinch. Through the peephole, she saw her son David and his wife Sarah. David looked uncomfortable, his shoulders hunched. Sarah, however, looked energized, her face a mask of perfectly applied, sympathetic concern. Elizabeth opened the door. Mom, David said, stepping forward to give her a clumsy, one-armed hug. We came as soon as we heard. How are you holding up? I'm fine, David, she said, her voice flat. Oh, you poor thing, Sarah cooed, sweeping past David to envelop Elizabeth in a cloud of expensive perfume. Her hug was all sharp angles and performative sorrow. To be put through this, at your age, it's barbaric. Truly. They guided her into the formal living room, the one reserved for important guests, sitting her down on the silk damask sofa. They sat opposite her, a tribunal of two. Dad is... Well, he's not thinking clearly. David began fidgeting with his tie. At 50, he still had the air of a boy seeking approval. This whole thing with this girl. It's a midlife crisis on steroids. It's a psychotic break is what it is. Sarah corrected her tone sharp. But we're not here to talk about him. We're here to talk about you, your future, your security. Elizabeth watched them. She saw how Sarah's eyes kept darting around the room, not with nostalgia, but with a cold, calculating gaze. She was appraising, inventorying. We need to be practical, Elizabeth Sarah said, leaning forward, her voice dropping into a confidential, businesslike tone. In a situation like this, the first thing to do is secure your primary assets. Liquidate what you can to protect it from complications. David cleared his throat. What Sarah means, Mom, is that we've been talking, and we think you should consider selling the house. The words hung in the air, sucking the remaining oxygen from the room. Sell the house. The house her father had helped her buy, the house where she had raised David, the house that held the imprint of her entire adult life. Why would I do that? Elizabeth asked, her voice dangerously quiet. The market. Sarah exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. The 2025 real estate market is on fire, an absolute inferno. A property like this in this location, the valuation would be astronomical. We're talking about a figure that could set up the entire family for generations. The entire family, Elizabeth repeated softly. Exactly. Sarah pressed on, oblivious. We can't let this opportunity pass. It's about market optimization. You have to strike while the iron is hot. We could leverage this asset into a diversified portfolio that would be completely insulated from Dad's legal maneuvering. I'm not moving, Elizabeth said. David sighed, a sound of profound parental disappointment. Mom, be reasonable. This house it's too much for you. The upkeep, the taxes, the memories. Think of it. We've found the most wonderful place for you. An upscale assisted living community over in Lake Oswego, the Evergreen Villas. It's more like a resort. They have a spa, chef-prepared meals, round-the-clock security. It's not a home, Elizabeth said. It's a smart home, Sarah interjected. It's a financially sound, forward-thinking residential solution. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. We would handle the sale, the investment, everything. It's a win-win. You get peace of mind, and we secure the family's future. There it was again. The family's future. Not her future. Not her peace of mind. Her home, her life was being discussed as a primary asset. Her existence was a line item on a balance sheet they were eager to cash in. She looked at her son, at the man she had nursed through fevers and celebrated birthdays with. His eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. He was looking at his wife, who nodded at him a silent command to press the point. Mum, Sarah's right, David said, his voice taking on a new, firmer edge. The echo of his father's condescending tone. You're being emotional. You need to think like a CEO right now. This is a strategic pivot. We need to divest from sentimental holdings and focus on core capital preservation. The corporate jargon spilling from her son's mouth was more obscene than any curse word. He was translating his greed into a language that made it sound responsible, even noble. And in that moment, the last vestiges of shock and grief within Elizabeth burned away, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This was not just about Richard and his vapid TikToker. This was a coup. Her husband had abandoned the throne, and her own child was now storming the castle not to save her, but to pillage the treasury before the kingdom collapsed. She wasn't just losing a husband. She was being discarded, written off, erased by her own family for profit. She stood up. The movement was so sudden it startled them both. "Thank you for your input," she said, the words precise and cold. "I will take it under advisement." Sarah beamed, mistaking Elizabeth's composure for surrender. "Oh, good. I'm so glad you're seeing sense. I'll have our realtor draw up the preliminary paperwork," I said. Elizabeth repeated her voice, cutting through Sarah's enthusiasm like a razor. "I will think about it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm very tired." It was a dismissal, clear and absolute. The king was gone, but the queen was still on the throne. David and Sarah exchanged a look of frustration, but they stood. They had miscalculated. They had pushed too hard too soon. They offered more empty platitudes at the door, more promises to call more suffocating false sympathy. When the door closed behind them, Elizabeth leaned her back against it, her eyes closed. The silence rushed back in, but it was different again. It was no longer the quiet of absence or the quiet of a mausoleum. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the first skirmish, the quiet of strategy, the quiet of a coming war. That night, sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. Elizabeth found herself wandering the cavernous, silent halls of her home, not a primary asset, not a sentimental holding. Her hand trailed along the wall, the cool plaster of familiar comfort. She passed the gallery of family photos. There was David as a toddler, Richard, beaming herself, younger, smiling a genuine smile. It all felt like a fiction now, a carefully curated exhibit of a life that never really existed. Her fingers paused on a large, formal portrait, taken in the late 70s. It was of her and her father, Thomas. He stood tall, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes, even in the faded photograph, sharp and discerning. He'd been a lawyer, not just a lawyer, but a titan. A man who could dissect a contract, or a person with the same ruthless precision. The memory didn't creep in. It arrived like a tidal wave, pulling her back 50 years back to 1975. She was 25 again, standing in her father's intimidating book-lined study. The air smelled of leather old paper and his faint, reassuring scent of pipe tobacco. She was incandescently happy her engagement ring, a gaudy thing Richard had insisted on flashing on her finger. She had just spent an hour telling her father all about Richard, his ambition, his charm, his grand plans for the future. Her father, Thomas, sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his hands steepled. He had listened patiently without interruption. When she finished, the silence stretched. "He has no money of his own," Thomas stated. It was not a question. "He has ideas, Daddy, incredible ideas?" Young Elizabeth insisted. "He just needs a chance. Capital." "My capital," Thomas said, his voice flat. "Your inheritance." "He loves me," she said, a hint of defiance in her voice. "Isn't that what matters? Love is an emotion, Elizabeth, a beautiful one. But it is not a business plan. And it is not a shield." He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick, blue-bound document. He slid it across the polished surface of the desk. "I have had my firm's best people look into Mr. Richard Davies. He is charming. He is ambitious. He is also a gambler, a man who views other people's money as a means to an end. His own end." "That's not true. You don't know him." "I know his type," her father said, his gaze softening slightly. "I have spent 40 years in courtrooms with men exactly like him. They build empires on charm and foundations of sand. I will not have my daughter's life be part of that foundation." He tapped the document. "This is a prenuptial agreement. I have drafted it myself. Elizabeth stared at it horrified. A prenup. Daddy, no. That's It's so cynical. It's like saying you expect us to fail before we've even begun. Richard would be so insulted. Let him be insulted, Thomas said, his voice hard as granite. He signs this, or he does not marry you with my blessing, and he does not see a single penny of my money. The terms are simple. What is yours remains yours. What you choose to invest from your inheritance into his ventures is structured as a loan, not a gift. And there are other clauses, protections. Days later, she was sitting with Richard in that same study. Her father was there, a silent, imposing presence by the fireplace. Elizabeth's hands were trembling as she pushed the document towards Richard. My father? He insists, she mumbled, her face hot with embarrassment. It's just a formality, for his peace of mind. Richard picked it up. He radiated a breezy, charismatic confidence. He barely glanced at the dense legal text. He was a young man in a hurry, about to marry into the wealth that would unlock all his dreams. This was just a small, bureaucratic hurdle. A firewall, eh? Richard chuckled, looking at her father. Don't worry, sir. I plan on building this woman a castle, not burning her house down. He flipped to the last page, took the fountain pen from her father's desk, and signed his name with a flamboyant, arrogant flourish. He didn't read the fine print. He didn't read the clauses about infidelity or the precise definitions of marital versus inherited assets. He just saw the finish line. After Richard had left glowing with his victory, Elizabeth had started to cry, ashamed and conflicted. Her father came over and put his arms around her. He was not a physically demonstrative man, and the gesture was profound. He held her for a moment, then looked her straight in the eye. His voice was low, urgent, and filled with a desperate love she wouldn't fully understand for another 50 years. This isn't about love, my dear. He'd said his words echoing in the silent house of 2025. And it's not about money. This document, this is a firewall for your soul. Back in the present, Elizabeth stood alone in the hallway, the polished floor cold beneath her feet. The memory wasn't a haunting. It was a map. A weapon left for her half a century ago by a father who had seen the future with terrifying clarity. The grief was gone. The shock was gone. The fear was gone. In their place, something else was crystallizing. Something hard and cold and purposeful. Her son had told her to think like a CEO. Her husband had called their divorce a corporate restructuring. They had reduced her life to the language of assets and divestment of profit and loss. Very well. She thought, a slow, dangerous smile touching her lips for the first time in days. It was time to liquidate. The air in the 40th floor law office was thin and tasted of recycled glass and steel. It was a world away from the scent of damp earth and roses at Willow Creek. Elizabeth sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the young woman across the polished mahogany desk. Ms. Chen was maybe 35, with a haircut so sharp it could draw blood and eyes that missed nothing. She turned the pages of the prenuptial agreement with a reverence Elizabeth hadn't seen since her father was alive. The thick, cream-coloured paper, brittle with age, seemed to absorb the light from the panoramic window overlooking the city. I've never seen anything like this. Mrs. Croft, Ms. Chen, said, her voice a low hum of professional astonishment. She looked up from the document, her gaze intense. This wasn't a prenuptial agreement. This was a fortress. Your father didn't just practice law, he wielded it like a weapon. Elizabeth offered a faint, sad smile. He didn't trust Richard, not from the moment he met him. Trust, Ms. Chen let out a short, sharp laugh. He built a legal cage and convinced Richard it was a palace. The initial asset declarations are meticulous. Every stock, every bond, every dollar from your family's trust that was used to seed Richard's first company. It's all here, itemized, dated, valued. She tapped a long manicured finger on a specific page. But this is the masterstroke. She read the clause aloud, her voice giving weight to every devastating word. The legacy protection stipulation. In the event of proven marital infidelity, proven not just alleged, all assets, properties, shares, and derivative profits originating from the initial marital endowment provided by the estate of Elizabeth's father shall revert entirely and irrevocably to Elizabeth Croft. The offending party, Richard Croft, shall be entitled only to his personal effects and any assets acquired independently with verifiable proof of funds, completely separate from the marital estate. Ms. Chen leaned back in her leather chair, shaking her head slowly. He has no independent assets, does he? Everything he built. It all grew from the seed money your father provided. Everything, Elizabeth confirmed, her voice, a quiet, steady note in the silent room. This clause. It's brutal. In today's legal climate, it would be called unconscionable. But in 1975, executed with this level of detail, signed and witnessed by members of the bar. She looked at Elizabeth, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. He's entitled to nothing. His suits, his shoes, his golf clubs. That's it. The house, the stock portfolio, the company he's so proud of. It's all built on a foundation that belongs to you. It always has. The silence stretched. It was filled with the ghost of her father's voice, the memory of his hand on her shoulder. This is a firewall for your soul, Lizzie. For 50 years she had thought he was being overly dramatic. Now she understood he had seen the future. He thought I was docile. Elizabeth said the words, coming out colder than she expected. He thought I was a part of the decor, something to be managed, and eventually discarded. Well, the decor is about to own the entire house. Ms. Chen said, her professional mask slipping to reveal a glint of predatory excitement. So, Mrs. Croft, what are your instructions? We can use this as leverage. Negotiate a very, very favourable settlement. Avoid a messy public fight. Elizabeth looked out the window at the distant, hazy line of the horizon. A settlement. A negotiation. More quiet compromises. More of the slow, grinding erosion of self that had defined her life. She had spent 50 years being reasonable. She had been reasonable when Richard missed anniversaries for business. She had been reasonable when he belittled her in front of his friends. She had been reasonable when he had announced he was leaving her for a girl young enough to be their granddaughter. Reasonableness was a cage she had helped him build around herself. She turned her gaze back to the young, sharp lawyer. No negotiation, Ms. Chen. Ms. Chen leaned forward, her interest piqued. No, Richard made his choice. Now he will live with it. I want you to enforce the agreement exactly as it is written. Elizabeth's voice was low, but it filled the cavernous office. I want you to file for divorce on grounds of adultery. I want you to serve him with the enforcement notice for the legacy protection clause. I want it done immediately. Today. Ms. Chen's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. Mrs. Croft, this is a declaration of war. He will fight. He will get the most aggressive lawyers money can buy. They will drag your name through the mud. They will call you vindictive, unstable. Let them, Elizabeth said. A strange calm settled over her, the deep, cold peace of a decision finally made. He left me with nothing. It's only fair I do the same for him. File the papers. The process server was a man who looked like he had been born in a cheap suit, his face a mask of bored indifference. He found Richard Croft at his new residence, a gleaming glass box of a condominium, with a view that cost more than most people's homes. Chloe was filming a TikTok in the living room, pouting at her phone while she unboxed a designer handbag. The doorbell chimed a polite electronic sound that was brutally out of place. Richard answered the door, a silk robe loosely tied a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was annoyed at the interruption. Richard Croft, the server asked, not meeting his eyes. Yes, what is it? The man handed him a thick manila envelope. You've been served. Richard took it, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He assumed it was some business nuisance. He closed the door without another word and tossed the envelope on a marble countertop. Chloe didn't look up from her phone. Who was that babe? Nobody. Richard grunted, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window, savouring his view, his new life. He took a sip of whiskey. After a moment, curiosity got the better of him. He picked up the envelope and tore it open. The first document was the petition for dissolution of marriage. Adultery. The word seemed to leap off the page, an archaic, ugly accusation. He scoffed. So the old woman had some fight in her after all. It was pathetic. Then he saw the second document. It was thicker, stapled to a cover letter from a law firm he'd never heard of. Notice of Enforcement Legacy Protection Stipulation. He started to read. Chloe finished with her video, finally looked over. What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost. Richard didn't answer. The blood drained from his face. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the polished concrete floor. He read the clause, then read it again. The language was precise, cold, and absolute. Revert entirely and irrevocably to Elizabeth Croft, entitled only to his personal effects. It couldn't be real. It was a joke, a bluff, a pathetic, desperate move from a woman he had already defeated. His shock curdled into a wave of pure, hot rage. It wasn't the fear of losing money. He couldn't even process that yet. It was the insult, the sheer audacious impudence of it. Elizabeth. His Elizabeth. The quiet, compliant, docile woman he had moulded and controlled for half a century. The woman who arranged his dinner parties, who picked up his dry cleaning, who managed the household staff with quiet efficiency. She was a function, an accessory. She wasn't supposed to do anything. That witch. He snarled the words tearing from his throat. He crumpled the papers in his fist, his knuckles white. That manipulative, senile old witch. Chloe jumped her phone clattering to the counter. She'd never seen this side of him. The charming, powerful, benevolent benefactor was gone. In his place was a cornered animal. Richard. What's wrong? What does it say? She's trying to ruin me. He roared, his face purple. After everything I've done for her. After the life I gave her. She and that bastard father of hers. They planned this. They plotted this 50 years ago. He began to pace a caged lion in his transparent prison. The fury was a physical thing choking him. This wasn't a legal problem. It was a rebellion, an uprising from a population of one. He snatched his phone from the counter, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. The first call was to David. She's lost her mind, Richard bellowed into the phone, forgoing any greeting. She's filed for divorce. She's trying to invoke some insane clause in the prenup. Some trap your grandfather set for me. David's voice was a mixture of confusion and alarm. Dad, slow down. What clause? What are you talking about? The money, David, all of it. She's trying to say it's all hers. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Sarah was on the speaker. Richard. What's going on? What does she mean? All of it. Get down here, both of you. Now. We're hiring lawyers, the best, the most vicious sons of bitches in this city. We're going to bury her. We'll prove she's incompetent, senile, that her father coerced her. We'll tear that document to shreds. We will tear her to shreds. 2 days later, Elizabeth sat in Ms. Chen's office again, a formal letter of response from a law firm named Kravitz, Thorne and Black on the table between them. The firm's reputation preceded it. They were sharks, known for scorched earth tactics and bleeding their opponents dry with endless motions and delays. Ms. Chen summarized their position. They're moving to have the prenuptial agreement invalidated. Their argument is threefold. First, that the document is archaic, a relic from a different legal era, and its terms are unconscionable by modern standards of marital equity. Elizabeth remained silent. Second, Ms. Chen continued, they are claiming you were a victim of paternal coercion, that your father, an overbearing and manipulative attorney, forced you into signing a document you didn't understand, exploiting your emotional vulnerability as a young woman. They're painting you as a pawn in your father's game against Richard. The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. They were using the truth of her relationship with Richard, her fear, her submission, and twisting it, aiming it at the one man who had tried to protect her. And third, Elizabeth asked. Third is the threat. They state that if you persist, they are prepared for a protracted and brutal court battle. They will subpoena your personal journals, medical records, friends, family. They will depose you for days on end. They intend to prove you are emotionally unstable and mentally unfit, acting out of spite. They want to make this so painful, so public, and so expensive that you'll drop the enforcement and agree to a conventional 50-50 split of the assets. Elizabeth felt a tremor of the old fear. Public humiliation. Her private life dissected by strangers. Her own son testifying against her. They knew her weaknesses. They knew she had spent a lifetime avoiding conflict, prizing privacy above all else. They were counting on that woman, the old Elizabeth, to shrink from the fight. But that woman was gone. She had burned to ash the day Richard had walked out the door. A different kind of pressure was building in her chest now. Not fear, but a cold, hard resolve. They thought this was about money. They thought they could bully her into submission. They saw an old woman. They didn't see the daughter of the man who had written that fortress of a contract. They are trying to intimidate me, Elizabeth said. Yes, Ms. Chen agreed. It's a classic strategy. Is it working? Elizabeth looked at her lawyer. It's making me angry. The call to her granddaughter was difficult. Elizabeth had always tried to shield Lily from the ugliness that festered just beneath the surface of their family. Lily was bright, idealistic, a student at Reed College, full of theories about social justice and digital ethnography. She adored her grandmother, seeing her as a figure of gentle grace and quiet strength. Grandma, is everything okay? You sound different. Lily's voice, clear and sharp over the phone, was a comfort. Lily, dear, I need your help. Elizabeth began feeling the weight of the words. It's something modern, something I don't understand. She explained the situation in broad strokes. The divorce, the legal battle. She didn't go into the details of the prenup, but she told her about Richard's new life, about the young woman named Chloe. He's with a TikToker. Lily's voice was laced with disbelief and a healthy dose of Gen Z disdain. Wow, that is the most cliché thing I have ever heard. Is he getting a sports car too? I believe he already has one, Elizabeth said dryly. Lily, his lawyers, and David's. They are trying to paint a certain picture of me. They are attacking the one thing my father left to protect me. I feel besieged. They're ganging up on you, Lily said, her tone shifting from sarcastic to fiercely protective. Of course they are. Dad and Sarah have been salivating over that house for years, so what do you need? You need a digital private eye. Because I can do that. This girl, Chloe, I know nothing about her except her age and her profession. Knowledge is power, they say. I feel powerless. Okay, Grandma, give me her name. Her full name if you have it. Chloe Perez. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Perez, Lily repeated slowly. Okay, let me see what I can find. People who live their lives online leave footprints everywhere. You just have to know where to look. For the next few evenings, Elizabeth's quiet sunroom became a war room. Lily came over after her classes, her laptop open her fingers, flying across the keyboard. Elizabeth would watch mesmerized and a little horrified as her granddaughter navigated a world that was completely alien to her. Lily moved effortlessly through layers of digital life, peeling them back like an onion. Okay, so her TikTok is all current stuff, brand deals, vapid lifestyle content. Useless Lily narrated scrolling at lightning speed. Instagram is the same, but it goes back further. Let's see. 2019, still just curated garbage. But people get lazy. They forget to scrub their past. Lily's search became more forensic. She moved from the glossy public-facing profiles to the forgotten graveyards of the internet. An old dormant Twitter account. A Pinterest board from a decade ago filled with dream wedding dresses. And then the jackpot, a Facebook profile untouched since 2015. People forget about Facebook? Lily murmured, her eyes narrowed in concentration. It's for old people now, they think. But their whole lives are on here. Tagged photos, family members. Oh, here we go. She clicked on a photo album titled Family BBQ 2012. The pictures were grainy, taken on an old phone. Chloe was a teenager, all awkward angles and braces. She was standing next to an older woman with tired eyes and kind smile, her arm wrapped around the girl's shoulder. Look at the tags, Grandma Lily said, pointing. Lily had been tagged as Chloe P. The older woman was tagged too. Mama Mags. Lily clicked on the tag. It led to another profile, this one almost completely empty, belonging to a Margaret Perez. The name hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Margaret Perez. The air left her lungs. A memory dusty and unpleasant surfaced from the deep archives of her mind, a memory she had deliberately buried for over 40 years. Grandma, are you okay? You're white as a sheet. Elizabeth couldn't speak. She just stared at the screen at the face of the smiling, tired woman. Margaret, her housekeeper, from 1978, the one who had been fired. What is it? Lily pressed her voice gentle. Who is Margaret Perez? Elizabeth finally found her voice, but it was a thin, reedy whisper. She used to work for us. A long, long time ago. At the house in Willow Creek. She gripped the arms of her chair, the polished wood cold against her skin. Richard fired her. He said she stole something. The sunroom, which had felt like a sanctuary, suddenly felt cold and haunted. The digital trail hadn't just led to a piece of information. It had led back into the darkest corners of her own home, to a story she had accepted without question. A story that was now beginning to unravel with terrifying implications. The past was no longer the past. It was sitting on a laptop screen, smiling out from a grainy photograph demanding to be seen. Elizabeth couldn't sleep. The name Margaret Perez echoed in her mind. It unlocked a room in her memory she had kept sealed for decades. She forced herself to open the door, to walk back into the suffocating quiet of the Willow Creek house as it was in 1978. She was younger then, but she felt just as old. David was a small child. The house ran on a schedule dictated by Richard's moods. Margaret was a good housekeeper. Quiet, efficient kind to David. She was a widow working to support her young daughter. Elizabeth liked her. She was a pocket of calm in a life of constant low-grade anxiety. Then came the incident with the watch. It was a Patek Philippe, a gift from a client ostentatious and loud. Richard adored it. He wore it like a trophy. One evening it was gone. Richard launched into a controlled, terrifying rage. He didn't shout. He never shouted. His anger was a cold, pressurizing force that sucked the air out of a room. He interrogated the staff one by one. His focus, his suspicion, landed squarely on Margaret. The memory played out in Elizabeth's mind with sickening clarity. The scene in Richard's study. the smell of leather and his expensive cologne. Richard, sitting behind his enormous desk, the watch's empty velvet box open before him. Margaret stood in the centre of the room, twisting the hem of her apron in her hands, her face pale with fear and confusion. "I didn't take it, Mr. Croft, I swear. I would never." Margaret pleaded, her voice trembling. "It was on my dresser this morning." Margaret Richards' voice was smooth, reasonable, and utterly menacing. "You cleaned the bedroom. No one else was in there. Now it is gone." These are simple facts. Elizabeth stood by the doorway, a silent spectator. She had felt a prickle of doubt. Richard was careless with his things. He was always misplacing keys, papers, cufflinks, and there was something in his eyes as he looked at Margaret. A cold, predatory gleam. It wasn't the anger of a man who had been stolen from. It was the satisfaction of a man setting a trap. "Perhaps you misplaced it?" Richard Elizabeth had dared to say her own voice, barely a whisper. He had turned his head slowly to look at her, and the look he gave her froze the words in her throat. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt, a look that said, "You are nothing. This is not your concern. Be quiet." And she had been. She had shrunk back, silenced by that look, by the suffocating power he held over her. She watched as he fired Margaret on the spot, refusing to give her severance, threatening to call the police if she ever set foot on their property again. Margaret had left in tears, humiliated, her reputation destroyed. A week later, Elizabeth found the watch. It had fallen behind the headboard of their bed. She remembered the feeling of cold dread as she picked it up. She had taken it to Richard, her heart pounding, expecting what? An apology? An admission that he had been wrong. He had taken the watch from her, his expression unreadable. "Good," he'd said, strapping it onto his wrist. "I must have knocked it off in my sleep." And Margaret Elizabeth had asked, her voice small. "You accused her? You fired her?" Richard had looked at her, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Don't be naive, Elizabeth. It was for the best. She was getting too familiar. And it sends a message to the rest of the staff. Don't get comfortable." He had admitted it. Not the theft, but the cold, calculated cruelty of his actions. He hadn't believed Margaret was a thief. He had simply wanted her gone, and ruining her was the most efficient way to do it. He had used the lie as a tool of power. And she, Elizabeth, had stood by and let it happen. The shame of her own cowardice washed over her now, as fresh and as bitter as it had been 40 years ago. She sat up in her bed, the moon casting long shadows across the room. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture so monstrous it took her breath away. Chloe Perez, Margaret's daughter. This wasn't a midlife crisis. This wasn't a random affair with a younger woman. This was something far more twisted. This was a message. A symbolic act of conquest. Richard hadn't just discarded an old wife. He had sought out the daughter of the woman he had wronged, the woman whose life he had casually dismantled for his own convenience. He was sleeping with her, showering her with the very wealth her mother had been accused of stealing from. It was the ultimate expression of his power, his dominance. It was a victory lap over a battle Elizabeth hadn't even known he was fighting. It was a way of erasing the past, not by atoning for it, but by desecrating it. He wasn't just destroying Elizabeth's present. He was rewriting their entire shared history, turning it into a monument to his own cruelty. This wasn't a divorce anymore. It was a psychological war, and she had just discovered that it had been waged against her silently and invisibly for decades. The cold resolve she had felt in the lawyer's office solidified into something harder, something sharper. This was no longer just about protecting what was hers. It was about exposing what he was. The world saw Richard Croft, the successful businessman, the pillar of the community. She would make them see the monster hiding in plain sight. The online attack began without warning. It wasn't a frontal assault, but a campaign of 1,000 cuts executed in the quiet, merciless echo chambers of Willow Creek's community Facebook groups. Sarah was the general, and her ammunition was pity. She posted a photo of David, taken from a low angle, his face etched with a carefully curated sadness, staring out the window of their sterile new money kitchen. The caption read, "It's been so hard watching my husband carry this weight. He loves his mother so much, but her recent confusion has been a challenge for all of us. Please keep our family in your thoughts." Elizabeth saw it when her neighbor Carol sent her a screenshot with a single question mark. Elizabeth's fingers, usually so steady when tending to her orchids, trembled slightly as she zoomed in on the comments. "Oh, Sarah, you are such a devoted daughter-in-law. Sending prayers. It's so hard when our elders lose their grip. Richard and David look heartbroken in that photo you posted yesterday. She's lucky to have you." Another photo appeared the next day. This one was of Richard looking pensive and noble, a black and white shot that made him look like a grieving patriarch from a forgotten dynasty. Sarah's caption, 50 years of devotion, a legacy he built with his own 2 hands. To see it all threatened like this. It's a tragedy. We are just trying to protect him and his life's work. The narrative was insidious and effective. Elizabeth wasn't a woman scorned. She was a woman unhinged. She wasn't fighting for her rights. She was a vindictive matriarch, a senile crone holding her loving family hostage out of spite. Each post was a small poisonous dart, and together they were creating a portrait of her that she no longer recognized. The poison was working. When she went to the local market, she felt the glances, the sympathetic, pitying smiles that were more painful than open scorn. Her phone stopped ringing with casual calls from old friends. She was being isolated, painted into a corner of her own home. Lily arrived that evening, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, her expression a mask of cold fury. She didn't say hello. She just opened her computer on the dining room table and turned it to face Elizabeth. "You've seen it," Lily said. It wasn't a question. Elizabeth nodded, her gaze fixed on the floral centerpiece she'd arranged that morning. "She's making me into a monster. Or a ghost. Worse." Lily counted her fingers, tapping a furious rhythm on the trackpad. "She's making you irrelevant. They're erasing you, Grandma. They're not just trying to take the house. They're trying to take your history, your place in this town. What can I do, Lily? Get into a mudslinging contest with a woman half my age on the internet? I don't even know my password." "You don't have to," Lily said, her eyes gleaming with a strategic light that reminded Elizabeth so much of her own father. "You don't fight fire with fire. You fight it with water. You fight lies with truth. But you do it quietly. You do it with dignity." "I don't understand. They're loud. We'll be quiet. They're telling a story about who you are now. We're going to remind people of who you've always been." Over the next hour, Lily laid out the plan. It was brilliant in its simplicity. She created a new Instagram account. Not in Elizabeth's name, not in her own. She called it Willow Creek Memories. The profile description was simple, celebrating the people and places that built our town. The first post went up that night. It was a faded color photograph from 1982. A much younger Elizabeth, her hair tied back in a scarf, stood laughing beside the mayor, holding a giant pair of scissors in front of a ribbon. The caption Lily wrote was pure objective fact. Elizabeth Ainsworth at the opening of the Willow Creek Public Library's new children's wing, which she personally fundraised for and helped design. Willow Creek, Church or Community, TBT. Elizabeth watched, fascinated, as Lily worked. She pulled out old photo albums, boxes of them, filled with a life Sarah and David had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. The next day, another post. Elizabeth, in 1995, covered in mud, and smiling planting a tree with a group of elementary school children for Arbor Day. The caption, "A town's roots are in its people." Elizabeth Ainsworth with the fourth grade class of 95. Then a photo from 2010. Elizabeth presenting a scholarship check to a bright-eyed high school senior at the annual town fair. The caption, "Investing in the future of Willow Creek." Lily never mentioned the divorce. She never mentioned Richard or David or Sarah. She didn't have to. The posts were a quiet, elegant counter-narrative. They weren't attacks. They were reminders. Each photo was a testament, a stone laid in the foundation of Elizabeth's true legacy. The shift was subtle at first. A like from the town librarian. A comment from the mother of that scholarship student. "She was so kind to my son. We'll never forget it." Then the owner of the local diner shared the library photo on his own page. "This is the Elizabeth I remember." Sarah's aggressive, pity-seeking posts started to look shrill and desperate in comparison. Her carefully staged photos of sad men seemed hollow next to decades of documented public service. The comments on her posts began to change. "This doesn't sound like the Mrs. Ainsworth who sponsored my son's Little League team for 10 years. A quiet tide of public opinion was turning not with a roar, but with the insistent, powerful whisper of shared memory. While the digital war of whispers raged, a more practical battle was at hand. Ms. Chen, her lawyer, needed more ammunition. "The prenup is strong, Elizabeth, but Richard's lawyers are trying to drown us in paperwork. They're claiming decades of emotional and non-financial contribution to your initial inheritance. They're arguing that his business acumen transformed your family's stagnant wealth. We need to find every financial record we can from the early years. Stock transfers, deeds, trust statements. Anything that shows exactly how your father's money was moved into Richard's first ventures." And so, Elizabeth found herself in the attic, a place she hadn't visited in years. It smelled of cedar and thyme. Sunlight streamed through a single dusty window, illuminating dancing motes of dust. She was looking for a specific filing cabinet her father had used, but her eyes fell upon something else tucked away under a heavy canvas sheet in the far corner. A dark green steel lockbox. Her father's lockbox. He had given her the key a week before he died. "Everything you might need is in here, Lizzie." He'd said, his voice a papery rasp. "But only open it when you feel you're standing on the edge of a cliff." She had never opened it. The grief was too raw, the idea of sifting through the final administrative remnants of his life too painful. For 20 years, it had sat in the attic, a silent metal tomb of memories she wasn't ready to face. But now, she was standing on the edge of a cliff. She retrieved the key from her jewelry box, its cold, familiar shape a comfort in her palm. Back in the attic, she knelt before the box. The key slid into the lock with a well-oiled click. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for a confrontation with the past, and lifted the heavy lid. There were no stock certificates, no property deeds, no bundles of bank statements. The box was almost empty. It contained only one thing: a single thick manila envelope lying flat on the green felt lining. It was sealed. There was no writing on the front. It was heavy, rigid, as if it held more than just paper. Her heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't what she expected. This wasn't a financial arsenal. This felt different, personal. She slid her finger under the flap, the dry glue crackling as it gave way. Inside was a stiff, folded document. The letterhead was from a place she recognized, a medical laboratory in Portland that had been on the cutting edge of genetic science back in the day. The date at the top of the page stopped her breath. October 12th, 1976. A year after David was born. Her mind, a fortress of secrets for nearly 5 decades, felt its walls begin to crumble. She knew what it was. She knew before her eyes scanned the clinical typewritten text. She remembered the desperation, the quiet act of rebellion. It had been after a year of marriage to Richard, a year in which she had seen the charming facade crumble away to reveal the cold, cruel narcissist beneath. The final straw had been his casual brutality towards a stray dog, a small act of violence that had illuminated his soul for her. A week later, at a charity fundraiser in the city, she had met a visiting professor. A kind man with gentle eyes who talked about poetry and listened, truly listened, when she spoke. It was one night, a desperate, foolish human attempt to feel something real in a life that had become a gilded cage. She never saw him again. When she found out she was pregnant, she let Richard believe the child was his. It was easier. It was safer. Her father, the shrewd lawyer who saw everything, had never said a word. But he had clearly suspected. He had seen the shift in her, the shadow in her eyes. And he had acted not with questions or accusations, but with foresight. He had secured this knowledge, this truth, and locked it away. A firewall for her soul. Her eyes finally focused on the bottom of the page. Subject: a Richard Ainsworth. Subject: B. David Ainsworth. Conclusion: the probability of paternity is 0%. Richard Ainsworth is excluded as the biological father. Elizabeth sank back on her heels, the dusty floorboards creaking under her weight. The air in the attic was thick, heavy, with the ghosts of 50 years. She held the document in her hands. It wasn't a shield. It was a sword. The ultimate weapon. A weapon she had never known she possessed, forged by her father's love and locked away until the day she needed it most. The war was no longer about money or property. It was about to become something else entirely. The final settlement conference was not held in a majestic courtroom, but in the suffocatingly beige and sterile conference room of a downtown law firm. The air smelled of weak coffee and expensive cologne. On one side of the gleaming mahogany table sat Richard, David, and Sarah, flanked by their lawyer, a man named Sterling, with a predator's smile and eyes that appraised everything in terms of its monetary value. They were a portrait of smug confidence. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, a look of bored entitlement on his face. David sat stiffly, avoiding his mother's gaze, while Sarah fussed with her phone, occasionally whispering into David's ear, a faint, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. They believed they had already won. They saw the woman across from them not as an adversary, but as a final, tiresome obstacle to be swept aside. Elizabeth sat alone, Miss Chen by her side. She was the picture of what they wanted to see, a frail, slightly confused old woman, her hands clasped in her lap, her expression placid. She had dressed simply in a soft grey cardigan that seemed to absorb the light in the room, making her appear smaller, more vulnerable. It was a deliberate, calculated performance. She remained silent as the proceedings began. Mr. Sterling launched into his opening salvo, his voice a smooth, threatening purr. "Let's be frank." He began spreading his hands wide, as if offering a generous gift. "We are all here to avoid a painful public and frankly unnecessary trial. Richard, my client, has been more than generous. His offer is substantial. It would allow you, Elizabeth, to live out your remaining years in comfort and dignity." He paused, letting the veiled threat hang in the air. "However," he continued, his tone hardening, "your recent refusal to cooperate, this insistence on clinging to an archaic and frankly unenforceable prenuptial agreement, is testing his patience. We have depositions. We have financial analyses from top-tier accounting firms demonstrating that the vast majority of the marital estate's value was generated directly by Richard's business genius over 5 decades. Your initial inheritance was merely the seed capital. He was the farmer who grew the forest." He leaned forward, directing his words at Elizabeth like bullets. If this goes to court, we will be forced to raise questions about your current state of mind, your capacity. We will discuss the undue influence of certain family members, he said, flicking a glance at the empty chair where Lily would have sat. It will be messy. Your reputation, the family's reputation, will be dragged through the mud. And in the end, the judge will likely see it our way. Accept the offer. End this now. Don't force us to burn everything to the ground. He sat back, satisfied. Richard nodded in approval. Sarah's smirk widened. David just stared at the polished surface of the table. There was a long silence. Ms. Chen looked at Elizabeth, ready to respond, but Elizabeth gave a subtle shake of her head. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the leather satchel at her feet. She pulled out a thin blue file folder. Her movements were unhurried, graceful. She didn't say a word. She simply placed the folder on the table and slid it across the polished wood. It came to a stop directly in front of Mr. Sterling. He looked at the folder, then at Elizabeth, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He opened it. Inside were several documents. He read the first page, his smug expression faltering slightly. He read the second, and his eyebrows shot up. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp. "It appears to be a sworn deposition," Sterling said, his voice losing its confident timbre. "From a George Tanaka, former groundskeeper at Willow Creek, dated last week." "And?" David asked, finally looking up. Elizabeth's voice, when she finally spoke, was clear and steady, cutting through the tension in the room. "George remembers Margaret Chloe's grandmother very well. He remembers the day she was fired. He remembers Richard telling him that Margaret had stolen his father's watch. He also remembers seeing that same watch on Richard's dresser 2 days later." Richard's face went rigid. "That's a lie. An old man's rambling. There's more," Elizabeth said, her eyes locking onto Chloe, who Richard had insisted on bringing a human trophy to flaunt his victory. "Slide the next document over to her." Reluctantly, Sterling passed a single sheet of paper to Chloe. It was a copy of a police report from 1978. A found property report filed by Richard Ainsworth for a gold watch he claimed had miraculously reappeared after being misplaced. He had never withdrawn the accusation against Margaret. He had simply let her name remain tarnished, her life ruined, because it was convenient. Chloe read the paper. Her perfectly made-up face, the face that smiled and sold products to millions on TikTok, turned a ghastly shade of pale. The color drained from her cheeks, as if a plug had been pulled. She stared at the date at Richard's signature. She looked up from the paper, not at Elizabeth, but at Richard. And in her eyes, he was no longer a powerful, charming benefactor. He was a petty, cruel man who had destroyed her grandmother over a lie. The disgust on her face was primal and absolute. The first crack in Richard's empire wasn't financial. It was the shattering of his own curated image in the eyes of his prize. "This is irrelevant," Richard snarled, slamming his hand on the table, trying to reclaim control. "It's ancient history, a desperate, pathetic attempt to distract from the real issue, which is the money." David, taking his cue, chimed in, his voice laced with practiced indignation. "This is what we're talking about, Mum. This vindictiveness, digging up old dirt, trying to hurt everyone. It's sick." They were scoffing, dismissing it, regrouping. They still thought this was a skirmish over the past. They had no idea that the real weapon was still to come. As their blustering filled the room, Elizabeth reached back into her satchel. She pulled out the second envelope, the heavy manila envelope from her father's lockbox. It looked innocuous, aged, almost fragile. She placed it on the table with a soft finality. The sound, small as it was, silenced the room. The air crackled. The arrogant confidence on the other side of the table evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp uncertainty. Elizabeth looked directly at Richard, her gaze as cold and clear as a winter sky. "The prenup was never about my money, Richard. You never understood that. My father knew you didn't value my money. You only valued what it could get you, what you could build with it. No, the prenup was never about my inheritance." She paused, letting the words sink in. "It was about my bloodline." Her eyes shifted to David. "Open it, David." David looked at his father, then back at his mother. Hesitantly, he reached out and took the envelope. It felt strangely heavy in his hands. Sarah leaned in her eyes wide with a mixture of greed and curiosity. Richard watched a muscle twitching in his jaw. David's fingers fumbled with the old flap. He pulled out the single stiff document. He unfolded it. The words were stark clinical, printed in the unforgiving typeface of a 1970s machine. Paternity test results. He saw his own name. He saw his father's name. His eyes scanned down the page past the scientific jargon to the final brutal conclusion. Probability of paternity, 00%. Conclusion. Richard Ainsworth is excluded as the biological father. The world stopped. The beige walls of the conference room seemed to melt away. The only sound was the frantic, panicked beat of his own heart. The words on the page made no sense, yet they were the only thing that had ever made sense. The coldness. The constant pressure to achieve. The feeling that his father's love was always conditional, a prize to be won, never a gift freely given. "I had a brief, desperate affair." Elizabeth said, her voice devoid of emotion. It was a simple statement of fact. "It was after I realized the kind of monster I had married. He was a good man, a kind man. It was only once." She looked at David, and for the first time, a flicker of a long-buried pain crossed her face. "My father suspected. He arranged the test. He put the results in that box to protect the only thing that was truly mine, to ensure that if you ever betrayed me," she said, her gaze swinging back to Richard, "you would lose everything. Everything you thought you had built. Everything you thought was yours." The revenge was complete. It was a masterpiece of annihilation. It wasn't financial. That was just collateral damage. It was biological. It was existential. In that one moment, she had not just disinherited Richard, she had erased him. His entire identity as a patriarch, a self-made man, the head of a dynasty, was a fraud. The son he had molded, the legacy he intended to pass on, was built on a lie he never even knew existed. Richard made a sound, a choked, guttural noise deep in his throat. The colour drained completely from his face, leaving behind a waxy grey mask. He looked old. He looked small. He stared at David, the boy who was not his son, and his entire world collapsed inward. Sarah's face was a rapid-fire calculation of loss. The inheritance, the family name, the social standing, all gone. She looked at David, not with sympathy, but with the cold appraisal of a banker looking at a defaulted loan. Her investment had just been wiped out. And David just stared into space, the document clutched in his white-knuckled hand. His life, his name, his face in the mirror. All of it was a lie. He wasn't David Ainsworth, heir to a fortune. He was a stranger, the son of a ghost. Chloe, forgotten by the rest, stood up quietly. She looked at the wreckage of the family, at the man she'd thought was a king, now reduced to a pathetic old fraud. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Elizabeth stood up. The grey cardigan no longer made her look frail. It looked like armour. She looked at the three shattered people sitting across the table, drowning in the ruins of their own greed. She felt nothing. Not triumph. Not pity. Just quiet. She turned and walked towards the door, Ms. Chen following behind. She didn't look back. She left them there in the sterile, silent room with the terrible, cleansing truth. The silence in the room was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on everyone thick and suffocating. It was heavier than the polished mahogany of the table, heavier than the decades of lies that had been spoken across it. The two sheets of paper lay between them, stark white against the dark wood. They were such small things to have caused such an immense detonation. Richard's lawyer, a man named Peterson, who prided himself on his unflappable demeanour, was the first to make a sound. It was a faint, wet gasp, as if he'd been punched in the gut. He looked from the papers to Richard, then to Elizabeth, then back to the papers. His brain, so quick with statutes and precedents, had simply stopped working. The legal framework he inhabited had no chapter for this. This wasn't a contractual dispute. This was an amputation of the soul performed without anesthetic. This is inadmissible, he finally managed, but the words were hollow, a flimsy shield against a nuclear blast. His voice was a thin reed in a hurricane. It's a fabrication, a cruel last-ditch. He trailed off because he was looking at Richard. Richard wasn't looking at the papers anymore. He was staring at Elizabeth. His face, which moments before had been a mask of smug certainty, had collapsed. The colour had drained from it, leaving behind a waxy grey pallor. His jaw was slack. His eyes, those eyes that had always held a glint of cruel amusement, were now wide vacant, staring into a chasm that had just opened up beneath his feet. He was seeing the last 50 years of his life rewriting themselves in real time. The pride he took in his son, his heir, the continuation of his name, it was all turning to ash in his mind. The dynasty he thought he had built was a phantom. The legacy he had secured was a lie he had told himself. He made a small choking sound. It was the noise of a structure breaking under impossible strain. David sat frozen, a statue of disbelief. His face was a perfect blank. He hadn't blinked. He hadn't moved. His gaze was fixed on the second envelope, the one Elizabeth still held, though he wasn't really seeing it. He was seeing his reflection in the polished table, but the face looking back was a stranger's. Who was he? If Richard wasn't his father, then who was he? The question was a virus flooding his system, deleting every file of his identity. His achievements, his failures, his entire sense of self had been tethered to being Richard Sterling's son. Now that tether was cut, and he was adrift in a terrifying, featureless void, Sarah was the first to recover. Her mind always pragmatic, always running calculations, processed the new data with terrifying speed. She looked at Richard, seeing not a patriarch, but a broken old man. She looked at David, seeing not the heir to a fortune, but the son of nobody. A biological dead end. The assets she had coveted, the real estate, the stocks, the Willow Creek estate, they were all tied to the prenuptial agreement, to Elizabeth's inheritance. And with the infidelity clause now proven beyond any doubt, David's claim, her claim through him, was worth less than zero. It was a debt of humiliation. Her expression hardened. The feigned concern she had worn for months melted away, revealing the cold, hard steel beneath. She slowly, deliberately slid her chair back from the table. The soft scrape of the legs on the carpet was deafening in the silence. It was the sound of a final transaction being closed. She stood up, smoothing down her designer dress. She didn't look at David. She didn't look at Richard. She looked only at her lawyer, a silent command passing between them. Game over. We're done here. She said, her voice clear and cold as ice water. It cut through the thick atmosphere. She turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance. Her heels clicked a brisk, merciless rhythm on the marble floor of the hallway, the sound of an investment being liquidated. Her departure broke the spell. Richard's body began to tremble. A low moan escaped his lips, a sound of pure animal agony. He tried to push himself up from the table, but his limbs wouldn't obey. His hand, reaching for the water glass, knocked it over. Water spread across the mahogany, pooling around the DNA report, the ink beginning to bleed slightly. A metaphor so perfect it was almost absurd. "No," he whispered. The word was a puff of air. "No, she's lying. Elizabeth, you're lying." Elizabeth met his gaze. For the first time in 50 years, she felt nothing when she looked at him. No fear, no anger, not even pity. It was like looking at a stranger, a historical footnote. "The truth doesn't care if you believe it, Richard," she said, her voice calm and steady. "It just is." And then he broke. It wasn't a scream. It was a wrenching, full-body sob that seemed to tear its way out of him. He slumped forward, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. His shoulders shook, great gasping shudders of a man whose entire world had been pulled out from under him. This wasn't about money. He had lost, but this was a different kind of loss. This was the loss of his own story. He was no longer the protagonist. He was a fraud, a footnote in someone else's life, a biological placeholder. David finally moved. He stood up slowly, mechanically. He looked down at the weeping man who was not his father. There was no emotion on his face, just a profound, chilling emptiness. He turned and walked out of the room, following the same path Sarah had taken, but his steps were heavy, shuffling the sound of a man walking to his own execution. Ms. Chen Elizabeth's lawyer quietly gathered the documents. She slid them back into a crisp manila folder. She looked at Elizabeth, a universe of respect in her eyes. "It's done, Elizabeth," she said softly. Elizabeth nodded. She stood up, her movements fluid and unburdened. She walked past the sobbing ruin of her husband, past the empty chair of her son, and out into the hallway where the air finally felt clean. The days that followed were a cascade of aftershocks. The legal fallout was swift and brutal. Richard's high-priced legal team, faced with irrefutable proof of infidelity, and the ironclad prenup, folded completely. They advised him to settle, to give Elizabeth everything she was owed, to avoid the public spectacle of a trial. But Richard was beyond legal advice. He had retreated into a silent world of his own making. He was checked into a private psychiatric facility, diagnosed with a severe depressive episode and psychological breakdown. The man who had commanded boardrooms and dominated every room he entered now sat staring at a blank wall, unresponsive, his legacy not just tarnished, but erased. Sarah filed for divorce from David the very next day. The paperwork was cold, efficient, citing irreconcilable differences. There was no last conversation, no tearful goodbye. She simply had her lawyer send his lawyer the papers. The life she had built with him was a portfolio that had crashed. She was cutting her losses and moving on. A friend of Elizabeth's saw her a week later, having lunch at an expensive restaurant, laughing with a group of women already scouting for a new, more promising merger. David didn't contest the divorce. He didn't do much of anything. He stayed in the guest room of a friend's house for a few days, not speaking, not eating. He'd stare at his phone for hours, looking at old photos, a fishing trip with Richard, his college graduation, Richard's arm around his shoulder, beaming with pride. A lie. Every memory, every touch, every word of paternal encouragement was now poisoned. A performance by a man who was, it turned out, a complete stranger. Then one morning, he was gone. He left a note for his friend that just said, "Thank you." He had turned off his phone, deleted his social media. He vanished. He simply stepped out of the life that was no longer his. But the final, most public demolition came from an unexpected quarter. Chloe, having fled the mediation in a state of shock and disgust, processed the information in the way her generation did best. She went live. The TikTok video was brutal in its simplicity. She sat in her car, the lighting harsh, her makeup smeared from crying. There was no filter, no trending audio, just her raw and furious. "I need to tell you guys something," she began, her voice trembling, but gaining strength with every word. "You all know me as the girl dating the older, wealthy businessman, Richard Sterling. And I know what a lot of you thought. Gold digger, clout chaser. I let you think it. I played into it. But you don't know the whole story." She took a deep breath. "That man, Richard Sterling, isn't just a cheater. He's a monster. Years ago, my grandmother Margaret worked for his family as a housekeeper. She was fired. He told everyone she stole from them. He ruined her name. She had to move away. She lived in shame for years because of a lie he told to get rid of her. Why, I don't know for sure. But I know it was a lie." Her eyes blazed with a righteous fire. "And today, I found out why he was so interested in me. A girl who looks a little like her grandmother. A girl with the same last name. This wasn't a romance. It was a victory lap. It was a sick, twisted way for him to conquer the ghost of a woman he wronged 45 years ago. To prove he could still take whatever he wanted from my family." The video cut to a picture of a young, smiling Margaret, then to a screenshot of an old newspaper clipping about Richard's business success. The juxtaposition was damning, and his wife, Elizabeth. Chloe continued, her voice thick with emotion. "The woman he was leaving for me, he spent 50 years gaslighting her, controlling her, and when she finally stood up for herself, he and his son tried to have her declared incompetent so they could steal her family's money, the money that funded his entire career. The son, it turns out, isn't even his. That's how deep the lies go in that family. It's a house of cards built on cruelty." She looked directly into the camera, her gaze piercing. "So yeah, I dated an older man. I was naive. I was stupid. But I was not a willing participant in this. I was a prop in a sick old man's power trip. This is for my grandmother Margaret. Her name was Margaret Jensen, and she was not a thief. Richard Sterling is. He steals lives. He steals dignity. Don't let him steal anyone else's." She ended the video. The view count exploded. 100,000. 1,000,000. 10 million. It was shared on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook news feeds. Justice for Margaret started trending. News outlets picked it up. His corporate partners issued statements distancing themselves. His name, once a symbol of success in Willow Creek, became a synonym for predatory evil. Chloe, in 3 minutes of raw, unfiltered testimony, had completed his social and public annihilation. She had recast herself from villain to victim, and in doing so had become the author of Richard's final pathetic chapter. The dust settled, but the landscape was forever changed. The grand house in Willow Creek stood silent, a monument to a fallen king. Elizabeth walked through its rooms one last time. The air was stale with memory. She didn't linger on the bad ones. That felt like giving them a power they no longer had. Instead, she thought of the small pockets of life she had carved out for herself within these walls. The way the morning sun hit the breakfast nook, the scent of the rose bushes she'd planted by the gate, the one part of the garden that was truly hers. She ran her hand along the armchair where she'd sat for thousands of evenings, feigning interest in Richard's stories. She looked at the grand staircase where David had taken his first wobbly steps. These memories were not lies. They were real. They had happened. But they belonged to a different woman, a woman who no longer existed. Keeping the house would be like keeping a dress she had long since outgrown. The real estate agent was a young, eager woman who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the property's good bones and timeless elegance. Elizabeth just nodded, signing the papers without reading them too closely. Ms. Chen had already vetted everything. The agent handed her the pen. "It's a beautiful home, Mrs. Sterling," the agent said. "So many memories, I'm sure. They're just walls." Elizabeth replied, her voice soft but firm. "Someone else can make memories in them now." She handed back the pen, took her purse, and walked out the front door, not looking back. She didn't watch the "for sale" sign being hammered into the manicured lawn. She just got in Lily's car, and they drove away, leaving the gilded cage of Willow Creek shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was gone completely. The change of seasons was a balm. The hot, angry summer of the divorce bled into a crisp, clear autumn. Elizabeth found a place in a quiet town on the Oregon coast, a place where the main sound was not the murmur of gossip, but the rhythmic crash of the Pacific Ocean. The condo was the antithesis of the Willow Creek house. It was modern, all clean lines, pale wood, and enormous windows that drank in the light. There were no dark corners, no heavy drapes, no ghosts. She and Lily unpacked the few boxes she had kept. Old photographs of her parents, her father's favourite books, a small hand-painted jewellery box her mother had given her. Nothing of Richard's made the journey. Nothing from that life. A new routine began to form, quiet and simple. Morning walks on the beach with Lily, the salty air sharp and clean in her lungs. Afternoons spent reading on her balcony, a cup of tea growing cold in her hand as she watched the gulls wheel and dive. She learned the names of the shopkeepers in the small town. She took a pottery class. She was not a wife. She was not a mother in the traditional sense. She was just Elizabeth. And for the first time, that felt like enough. It felt like everything. One evening, months after the move, she was sitting on the balcony. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in strokes of orange and violet. Lily was inside, making dinner, the sound of her humming a gentle counterpoint to the roar of the surf. Elizabeth's phone, which now brought her no anxiety, buzzed on the small table beside her. She picked it up, a message from an unknown number. Her finger hovered over the delete button. A wrong number, probably. But something made her open it. The message contained only 6 words. "Who was he, my father?" Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. There was no name signed, but she knew. It was David. The words were not an accusation. They were not a demand. They were a question. A simple, heartbreaking human question from a son searching for the first chapter of his own story. The old relationship, built on a foundation of lies and expectation, was shattered beyond repair. But this message, this was different. It was a fragile seed pushed up through the rubble. The beginning of something new, perhaps. Something honest. She didn't know how to reply. The answer was complicated, tangled with her own pain, and a brief, long-ago moment of lonely defiance. But for the first time, she felt a path forward was possible. A path that didn't involve forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. Lily came out onto the balcony, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She saw the look on Elizabeth's face, the phone held loosely in her hand. "Everything okay?" Lily asked, her voice gentle. Elizabeth looked up from the phone, out at the vast, endless horizon where the sea met the sky. The last light of the day was fading, but it wasn't an ending. It was a clearing. She felt the salt spray on her face, tasted it on her lips. It was the taste of the ocean, the taste of tears, the taste of a life washed clean. She was alone in a way. The family she had known was gone. But she was not lonely. She looked at Lily, this bright, fierce girl who was her true legacy. She took a deep breath, the ocean air filling her, clearing the last of the shadows. "Yes," Elizabeth said, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. "Everything is okay." She slipped the phone into her pocket. She would answer him. Later. For now, she just wanted to watch the sky. She stood beside her granddaughter, 2 women on a balcony, looking out at an unwritten horizon. She was no longer a prisoner of her past. She was free, finally, unequivocally free.